Seared into the public mind as both lawless predators and anti-heroes extolled by the media, the gang known as the Crips and their perennial rivals, the Bloods, have insinuated themselves into the inner city and the public consciousness and established themselves, for good or ill, as drivers of cutting-edge culture. Who they are and how they came to be are questions whose answers are as fascinating as they are problematic. During World War II, compelled by the imperatives of a war economy, the U.S. government made it illegal to discriminate based on race. This instigated a large-scale migration of Black Americans to South LA, hoping for jobs in the city's extensive industrial base. However, due to the racist attitudes at the time, blacks were redlined out of white neighborhoods by banks and restricted to their part of town by people like William H. Parker, LA's police chief from 1950 to 1966. Anger and resentment at these circumstances led to the Watts riots of 1965. And attempts to respond to these circumstances by political organizations, such as the Black Panther Party, were stifled when leaders of such organizations were targeted by FBI programs such as COINTELPRO. It was within the context of this lack of community leadership that in 1969 the Crips were formed, when Raymond Washington and Stanley "Tookie" Williams, two Los Angeles gang leaders, decided to unite their gangs into a larger gang. At first, the Crips engaged in small-scale thuggery, robberies, and extortion, mostly against their own people. However, eventually, the violence escalated. One night in 1972, after a Curtis Mayfield concert, Robert Ballou Jr. was beaten to death by 20 Crip members after he refused to give up his leather jacket. This was the first time a gang fight crossed the line into murder, and in response, neighboring gangs united to defend themselves against the Crips, calling themselves the Bloods. The Bloods wore red to distinguish themselves from the Crips, who wore blue. The rivalry between the Crips and the Bloods would grow, and according to Black Los Angeles, between 1972 and 1979, accounted for the majority of the approximately 450 gang-related murders in South Los Angeles. In 1979, Stanley Williams was sent to San Quentin Prison on 4 counts of murder. Convicted and sentenced to death in 1981, he was lethally injected in 2005. Later, in 1979, on the corner of 64th Street and San Pedro, Washington was killed in a drive-by shooting. According to Michael Krikorian, who covers street gangs for the LA Times, it was the beginning of the end of the Crips as a united gang. From that moment on, factions of Crip-on-Crip warfare became the norm. The crack epidemic of the early 80s amplified the violence of gang activity. By 1980, the murder rate had increased by some 50%. It also instigated a migration of Crips and Bloods into the rest of the country as they searched for new markets. According to a 1989 Washington Post article, LA gang members moved into new towns, recruited and ran drugs from Los Angeles to as far as Baltimore. By 1990, you could find young people affiliated with either the Crips or the Bloods in most U.S. cities. By the late 1980s, South Central gang culture had infiltrated the larger national culture. Rap groups such as NWA turned their gang experiences into music, and Hollywood jumped in with films such as Colors, Boys in the Hood, and Menace to Society. By the mid-90s, the South Central gangster had become a figure of fascination and cutting-edge cultural mores. An anti-hero, emulated by young people in the same way the cowboy was for an earlier generation. White teenagers from wealthy neighborhoods fashioned themselves as gangsters. While such films and music may create awareness, some fear the worldwide distribution of such images reinforces negative images of Black Americans. In recent years, gang violence has diminished. According to Uproxx, a culture news website, gangs like the Bloods and the Crips have gone more white-collar, engaging in easier and more lucrative crimes, such as identity theft, counterfeiting, selling stolen goods, and even bank, credit card, and mortgage fraud. Also, the prominence of miscreant police killings of Black people, such as George Floyd, have brought scrutiny on a legal system that, some would argue, devalues the lives of Black Americans. This awareness has redirected some intergang violence towards more unified and constructive community action. In 2015, Baltimore Bloods and Crips declared a truce after the death of Freddie Gray, who was murdered by police in their town. According to the Los Angeles Daily News, their peace accord also included no members are to take part in looting or rioting. In a sense, the tragedy of gangs is that, fostered and perhaps perpetuated by neglect of and disinterest in poor communities, it is a phenomenon that preys largely on these poor communities. Until young people, boys in particular, are provided with more constructive outlets and opportunities, the gang phenomenon will blight vulnerable communities and drive a tragic status quo of death and imprisonment.
This is Deviant Knowledge. Thanks for watching.